Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So let me first share the screen on my presentation file. Okay, hope everyone can see it. Now time is limited, so what I want to do is to quickly give you a summary of what I intend to present, and then move on to the details. Now, first of all, as indicated by Samki, that the following presentation is based on the working paper, which is available. I hope that everyone has had the chance to have a quick look. Now, just to give a quick summary, that as we note, the comparative performance of China between China and the US in controlling the pandemics has been very conspicuous. And this obviously needs explanations. And one line of investigation is to focus on comparative political economy, that is, to look at the nature and functioning of the respective governance structures, therefore also offering pointers for understanding the more basic political economic system of the two countries. Now, of course, given that the pandemic is still unfolding and is very current events, that there does not exist a sizable scholarly literature of researching on the pandemics. Nevertheless, it is still discernible that many comments and many studies tend to rely on the notion of information transparency as the main tool for making sense of the pandemic and the response by different governments. Obviously, this draws on the work of Amartya Sen, and most famously, his work of comparing the Great Famine of China during the Great Leap Forward in comparison with the Great Famine in India, in the West Bengal, in the earlier parts of the 20th century. Now, I would try to submit the arguments that this focus on information transparency is not sufficient for making sense of what has been going on with the pandemics and the responses. Instead, I will try to make use of the theory of exit, voice, and loyalty developed by Albert Hirschman, which highlights the fact that information and knowledge might be different. And therefore, for properly responding to the pandemics, it requires the important role of active cooperation in the endeavors of coping with the pandemics. And in this perspective, therefore, concerning the governance, it can be argued that China's tough model of coping with the epidemics is associated with a virtuous circle of the state-people interactions, whereas the US lax model entails a vicious circles. And from here, we can say a few words about the judgment over the basic political economic systems. Now, also I think you have received the information that there are 4 suggested readings that are immediately relevant to today's presentations. Now, quickly moving on to what has been going on, that is the background. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic is still unfolding fully after 7 months. 7 months when after China confirmed the outbreaks in the 20th of January, and there's no sign of the pandemic subsiding, because as we can see quickly, from this snapshot, that the daily new cases and daily deaths are still in the highest regions of what has come out so far. And then within this broader context of the world scale developments, we know that the China-US comparison is the most eye-catching. That's the US number of accumulated number of infections and deaths was 65 times and 37 times respectively of China. But in a nutshell, the US has done very poorly relative to the world average, and China is on the opposite side. And if we further take into account of population size, whereby China is more than 4 times of the US, and if we further take into account of income levels, then the US performance is really miserable. Now, we know that in the 2019, the Global Health Security Index, which put US in the best position, ranked number 1 in its preparedness for health emergencies, whereas China was ranked the 51st. Right? And the index is mainly constructed on the basis of the material conditions for individual countries in preparation for the health emergencies. And given that the US is considered to be the best prepared, whereas China is more or less equivalent to the average of the world, one should expect the US to have been doing much better in coping with the pandemic. But the reality, as we have already seen, is the opposite. So somehow, therefore, it is possible to infer that policy institutional reasons are far more important than the differences in the necessary material conditions. Now, it's not just in terms of coping with the epidemics in terms of the scale so far, but also the duration. Right? That in the case of China, that after 2 months of the outbreak, right, that it fell basically to 0. Right? In contrast to the case of the US, whereby the number continues to stay in the peak regions fully up to 5 months of the outbreak in the US territories. Right? This will give you a quick indication, right, that the US, after the first peak of the late April, and instead of going down, just like the case in China or the EU, it jumps upwards and remains in the high regions up until now. And therefore, the economic and social causes are also very different. Right? That in the case of China, it recorded a negative 6.8% of economic growth in Q1, but then it rebounded to a positive growth in Q2. In the case of the US, the growth was negative in Q2 because its outbreak was roughly from the middle of March, right? And therefore the Q2 was mostly was the high, the first peak. Right? But then it's widely predicted to remain negative in Q3 and probably further on. Right? So this is the projections by the IMF. Right? You can see that the three red curves, the China 1 was the projections by the IMF last year, October 2019. And China 2 is the projection in April 2020. And China 3 is in April, as in June 2020. And you can see that in comparison, the US has been far more, the damage to the US economy has been far more serious. And the IMF has continued to adjust its projections you can see that the situation has been worsening and worsening. In the case of China, the world average and the US, but in terms of the scale of the worsening, the US clearly stands out relative to the rest of the world, and in particular in comparison with China. Now, in terms of social costs, of course, fighting pandemics of these scales, there is always a requirement of maintaining a balance between individual rights and collective values. That is to say, that social cost is inevitably related to the broader context of the collective, individual, and hence state-people relations. Now, in the case of China, it is discernible of widespread resentment, in particular in the second half of January and the first half of February, to the excessiveness caused by the tough model of contact tracing, social distancing, etc., and also the mishandling of the governments, the local governments mostly. But nevertheless, on the whole, there is confidence, is sufficiently confident to judge that there is no anti-state, no anti-establishment feelings of a systematic scale. In the case of the US, the anti-lockdown and anti-racist movements exhibits a strong anti-state, anti-establishment character, reflecting the resentment to the lax model where the poor and the vulnerable of the society bear the brunt of the epidemic. Now, I won't be able to go into the details of the actual policy measures for coping with the epidemics in the two countries, but at the more conceptualized level, it can be said that China's is mostly a tough model that takes the, but before talking about the tough model, we also need to talk about the initial response, because China is unique in the world as the first country to have discovered and reported the outbreak of the coronavirus, and therefore its response in the initial outbreaks, that is to say before the formally confirming the outbreaks in the 20th of January, right, that initial response has remained a topic of controversy. But still, it is defensible to say that there were certain degrees of malfeasance on the part of the bureaucratic system, both the local authorities, local bureaucrats, and the public health professionals. And then, secondly, there was also a parallel process of functioning by the public health system as a whole in terms of scientific investigations and state action correspondingly, and that basically fulfilled its duties. The problem is that the functioning of the health system, even at its best, was far insufficient for preventing and controlling the epidemics of this time. And this was worsened to some extent by the malfeasance of the bureaucratic systems. Now, once the epidemic was confirmed, the state society adopted very tough measures in response, like the national mobilization of healthcare resources to support the regions, in particular Wuhan City, Hubei province, to provide testing and medicating for free for everyone in need. And for more than 2 months, major cities and regions of the countries were virtually locked down in order to suppress the spread of the virus. And there were comprehensive testing and medicating together with almost universal contact tracing and social distancing. And in fact, post-lockdowns, these measures since the mid March up until now, these measures remains readily available to apply if needed. Say, for example, we witnessed what happened in Beijing in the mini outbreak in June. So a state-led system of supply of basic necessities for people under the lockdown, apart from the initial chaos in Wuhan, mostly in February. Otherwise, the system was basically adequate to sustain the livings of ordinary people. Now, the US, in contrast, was in a state of inactions for more than 2 months since the outbreak of the first case in its territories on 22nd January. Now, when the epidemic did subsequently strike from roughly the mid-March onwards, the response was quite erratic. Testing, tracing, and social distancing practices were slow to catch up. And the lockdown measures were then largely loosened from the middle of May onwards, whilst the epidemic was still in full swing. And there have been no reasonable alternatives other than the testing, tracing, and distancing. Fine, if this testing, tracing, and distancing were very comprehensively applied in the case of China, if it's found that these are not feasible or not desirable in the context of the United States, then somehow some alternative practices need to be in place. But the point is that there was virtually none, no reasonable alternatives in place to combat the epidemic. Now, in terms of the cause of the mishandling of the epidemics, of course, it can be said that the immediate cause is the Trump presidency, that if anything, it has been mostly to undermine the efforts needed for controlling the epidemics. And whatever the level of adequacy or otherwise of the existing public health systems, it has been curtailed in capabilities and obstructed in functioning by the presidency. Now, this is not to say that the Judge Donald Trump himself or his administrations are the cause of the mishandling. Now, at this point, we have the very famous argument by Hirschman that the mishandling or misbehavior or the malfeasance by agents of any systems are in fact quite often the case, almost a normalcy. And in particular, in our question of discussion here that about the epidemics, which came out as almost an unexpected unknown in the case of China in the beginnings, which China gradually transformed it into a kind of expected quasi-knowns, but still with insufficient knowledge about the precise mechanism of transmissions. Now, therefore, it is acceptable to some extent that agents make mistakes. Now, the point is that any functioning systems or institutions would have its collective mechanisms to correct mistakes. The thing is that there is little in evidence in the case of the United States, indicating that the failure is really on the part of the natures of the agents and the institutions, rather than a matter of personality of President Trump himself or the failure of his or administrations. And therefore, we can make use further of the Hirschman types, the frameworks of exit, voice, and loyalties for analyzing the governance structures in the comparative governance structures of China and the US, which then will hopefully also provide some pointers for understanding the more fundamental basic political economic system of the two countries. Now, it's very important to note that the Hirschman's framework of exit, voice, and loyalty is not just a taxonomy of a description of three different options, but rather an analytical framework at the heart of which is the products being produced or being traded in some other circumstances. And the product for today's topics refers to state collective-led endeavors based on sufficient information flows and on knowledge acquisitions for combating the coronavirus crisis, which initially was an unexpected unknown and later an expected quasi-known. Now, the exit option was a pure market relationship that are arm's length in nature, and the product being traded is well defined and clear to both sides, so that either side can enter or terminate the relationship. That is the endeavors of combating the crisis at any point in time. And the exit obviously is a non-option in this circumstance because it is the crisis, the coronavirus crisis is nothing and with perfect information. It's far from that. Now, the voice option is a long-term relationship that are still market exchange, that you should say they are necessary to safeguard the exchange when information incompleteness or asymmetry could fundamentally undermine the exchange. Loyalty, on the other hand, while being also long-term relationship, it requires cooperation rather than competitions for yielding the desirable outcomes, that is to say, for successfully controlling the crisis. Now, just to wrap, right? As mentioned, the exit is a non-option because the epidemic is an objective existence entailing compulsoriness for every individual rather than an ordinary goods or service whereby individuals are free to choose. Right? So what happens in the US is an exit option exercised by both the state, which seems to be giving up from time to time or most of the time, and even the individuals, because of the fact that most of the poor people bearing the brunt of the crisis without sufficient means for both for the testing and medication, and also with their livelihood being largely damaged by the crisis, and therefore they would put it as a secondary consideration in terms of controlling the epidemics. They would rather need to take far more seriously their livelihood. Now, what did it happen, or why did it happen in the case of the US, between the state and the people and among individuals? The immediate answer is the lack of trust, but this is only a superficial answer. Now, turning to the case of China, that the initial bureaucratic mishandlings suggest certain degree of blocking information flows, that is the lack of the voice option, or the blocking the knowledge of acquisitions. And that needs a little bit explanation, that from the timelines of officially provided, it can be seen that the professionalism of China's disease control and prevention system actually did work and with reasonable speed. And some commentaries would even say that it did very well by international comparisons. But nevertheless, in relation to this time run, to the COVID-19 epidemics, the system was insufficient. It did not take into consideration of the on-site, the knowledge acquired through on-site learning by the frontline doctors. Right? That is to say, it worked to some extent as the voice option in terms of the professional systems, but it didn't work well as the loyalty options. Now, subsequently, when the outbreak was confirmed and therefore the drastic measures were imposed, these were not just superimposed by so-called authoritarian states, but rather they're involving the active cooperation between the state and the people of down to the grassroots level of the systematic scales. And therefore, it can be claimed that the loyalty option was in place in the case of China. Now, therefore, a final comment, the pointers to the understanding of the basic political economy of China. Now, all too often, and indeed up until now, that the existing the public space commentaries in the public space have been under the influence of the prevailing the ideology of the democracy versus authoritarianism, and the U.S. is considered to be, if not representative of, at least in line with democracy, whereas China is labeled as authoritarian. Now, most commentators therefore have had difficulty of making sense of the comparative performance in terms of coping with the epidemics, and they tend to argue that it is premature to make a judgment, right, given a longer enough time frame that the US is likely to do better than China. Of course, this is a bit fundamentalist version. A more moderate version is that something needs to be done to improve the US system. And commentators will argue that rebuilding the degree of trust in the US society and political economy is needed, but without saying how to do it. Now, an alternative to the prevailing ideology of democracy versus authoritarianism is to look at the substance rather than the form, the substance that is the accountability of the state to the people and the representativeness of the state for the peoples. And of course, this is very much the Chinese official ideology. China self-labeled as the people's democracy as opposed to the bourgeois or liberal democracy of the West. Of course, this is also very much a Leninist tradition. But Lenin makes the very famous statement that bourgeois democracy is, after all, still bourgeois dictatorship. Right? And therefore, the epidemics, the pandemic, and the experience of coping with the pandemic does point to the direction that we need to investigate into the issue of accountability and representativeness, right, of the state in relation to the peoples, right, rather than just the formalistic issues about competitive election or otherwise. And this being the case, then we have we need to go much deeper into the investigation of the nature and functioning of the political economy of both China and the US. So I stop at this point and hope you find the presentation sensible. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. Over to you now, Heiko.
Thanks very much, Dick, for the presentation and for the documents and the initiative in the first place. In the references that you've given to look at, there are a couple of divergent references. For example, the references from Olan Yu, and also the one about Hong Kong and the, if you like, role of skepticism towards state power in Hong Kong that is considered by some to be also a type of mobilizing force. Skepticism being a means by which people, if you like, galvanizes them also to act against something that they consider to be a real threat. So that's an interesting angle I think it would be worthwhile addressing in your response. As you know, a number of us have been discussing the question of the character of the Chinese state and Chinese society, both from the standpoint of looking at to what degree China is still within the parameters of the systems that existed in the Soviet Union or previous, you know, in the past in China and so on. Is there some continuity in the way that the state, the party, and the people relate together, regardless of the degree of private ownership in China, which, you know, everybody knows about? And the big contention in left-wing circles is that China has become capitalist, and therefore, and it's a type of crony capitalism, and therefore the peculiarity about what's happened since the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak is that it seems to have reinforced the argument that China can't quite be such a crony capitalist system if it can respond so effectively to a crisis like this. Or alternatively, it's an extraordinarily effective crony capitalism, which of course is also a theoretical possibility. And as you know, I mean, your own views on this would be useful, and perhaps the perspectives which you know about from which different people have put forward about this question would be relevant, because it goes to the heart of the debates in the West about what is China, which of course is central to another narrative and discussion, which is, you know, the China, anti-China, almost like war sentiment that's developing, that's been connected in with the virus. You know, talks about the virology lab and all this sort of thing. Initially, they seem to be promoted by a sort of fringe associated with Steve Bannon, who's just been arrested, as you know. It seemed to be associated with them, but it became very mainstream and widespread, part of the whole, like, for example, when Chinese people wore masks at the beginning, when they were abroad, they were often attacked and so on, at least verbally, some physically, but mostly verbally. And then the whole issue about Chinese people eating bats and all this type of hysteria that began to develop, and that's fostered an anti-China. And then that's been associated with the whole economic conflict with China, Huawei and all the rest of it. So some discussion on those themes obviously would be useful. As far as the bureaucracy is concerned, it seemed to me that although the central state and party made a few decisions early on, well, the most draconian decisions obviously were made in some way by the very central leadership. But this whole question about the way in which they mobilized the people in order to protect them seems to go to the core of what's happening in China. And it seems to be, I mean, I spoke to some people, this is purely anecdotal, but I spoke to some people and they said, firstly, they were very impressed from China. Firstly, they were very impressed in the way in which, for example, Zhong Nanshan, I think he's the lead epidemiologist in China. He's famous for having fought the SARS-1 virus the campaign about that he played such a leading role, and that medical staff, experts and so on played such a leading role in the whole decision-making process, and that they were the people confronting the public, not so much the party officials, but more these experts in the field. And a corollary to that, perhaps, was the support that Li Wenliang received when he came down ill and was known as the whistleblower, from wide layers of the population, if you like, supporting that lower level of officialdom or of state staff, if you like, who might be critical of upper aspects of the government or of the local government in that particular case. And my friend says to me, well, now the people are pretty much like lower level bureaucrats have got an enormous amount of power now. So as a consequence of having fought this campaign, it seems that, so for example, you know, the bureaucratic hierarchies that already existed, but that were associated with the campaign against the virus, by being successful, they've increased their power vis-a-vis, for example, the private sector, or vis-a-vis those elements of the bureaucracy that are not directly connected to this, although I don't know which ones would not be connected in some way or other. So a few words on that, how the bureaucracy, if you like, post-pandemic is functioning, or is likely, in your view, to move. Because there are, for example, we've had discussions about the moves towards opening the capital account, facilitating even more international capitalist enterprises to operate, promoting the private sector vis-a-vis the state sector, which has been an ongoing theme for decades actually in China. And if you were to read the documents from the mid-90s up until today, you know, you would have had, and many left-wingers have had, you know, sort of, you know, the hair raising on their backs in fear that the capitalist restoration in China is something imminent. And yet each time these policies somehow came to be something different when they were actually implemented than what was talked about on paper and feared, for example, in the West. For example, WTO membership, I remember when that was being discussed initially, many people screamed and shouted, this inevitably means the restoration of capitalism and the tying up to the world law of value and so on. And yet when it came down to it, something quite different emerged. And so is this contradiction that I think also requires some discussion, not only from yourself, but perhaps from other members of the audience might like to come in on all these questions. I'm particularly keen on hearing from people, if anyone knows, about the details from different provinces in China, about the way in which policies during the lockdown were carried out. I just read a document this morning about the spread from Wuhan. And actually, they did nip it quite early in the bud. There were about 5 million people left Wuhan before the lockdown during the run-up to the Chinese New Year. And it seemed that 2 million of them left the province, but somehow the control mechanisms and the demand to stay at home for a certain period of time was sufficient, and the obedience to that was sufficient to, if you like, catch the cases and lock it off, despite this huge movement of people that took place at that time, not only from Wuhan, but all around the country. So those things come up. And then the next question is the question of privacy. I mean, it's not a lot of these questions aren't exclusive to systemic questions, you know, whether the system's planned or capitalist or non-capitalist or whatever. But they do get raised quite a lot about the privacy issues in China, you know, the ability, for example, of the state to monitor people's whereabouts much more tightly and without restriction than in the West. Did that play a role, or was it really the local community that was central to the eradication measures which were taken? I think that will do for now. Is that right, time-wise? Yeah, just about, isn't it?
Okay, so just a quick response. Right now, at the heart of everything is the state. In the case of China, right, that what is is functioning, and therefore we try to infer what is its character on nature. Now, just to begin with, initially I provide the one suggested reading on Hong Kong, whereby which is a paper that is coming up in World Development of the journal, and I and myself quite skeptical of their skepticism of the state, that they claim that civil societies, NGOs, would be the main that would be the necessary their activism for combating the epidemics, whereas the state is impossible to take a hands-off approach rather than to involve actively in the process. Now, I have very, very strong reservation over these arguments, in particular with my personal experience myself about what has happened in Hong Kong, what has happened, that it's a divisive society with no such thing as the single type of civil society, but rather very confrontational relationship between different parts of the society. And therefore, in the face of such epidemics, which I mentioned, that it involves so-called its objective existence, involves compulsoriness vis-a-vis everyone's, it is impossible to keep the epidemic under control without the state playing a leading role. But of course, that is necessarily not sufficient condition, because there is always the question as to what kind of state we are talking about. Right? And that moves on to the case of the Chinese state and society. Right? Now it's clear enough that for people, or for the lives, saving the lives of people rather than for profits, that was the first principles governing China's response to the epidemics. That's almost universal compulsory testing for everyone's for free, medication for free, and this was in stark contrast to the case of the United States, whereby many people are unable to pay for the cost of the medical, the healthcare. And again, Hong Kong is one example. The medical establishments strongly opposed the mainland Chinese help for providing free testing or free medication. Instead, the Hong Kong medical establishment wants the government to provide the money for every citizen to do the testings by purchasing the services of the private clinics, private hospitals. Right? That's really exceedingly selfish. Right? And of course, they claim to be part of the civil society. Right? Now, anyway, so it's clear that the principle is for the lives of people, saving the lives of people, not for profit. And it's not just the principle, it's the action that the Chinese state was able to initiate different programs and to mobilize the entire nation's medical resources, healthcare resources for achieving these objectives. Now, it's also true that it's not just medical issues, but also the social control of the control of social distancing and contact tracing. And it's also widely reported of the self-empowerment of local authorities. That's Heiko has just mentioned, and I think that's true. But bearing in mind that the other side of the coin is the tremendous increase in the pressure on local authorities of different levels, or party state officials, in terms of the efforts to fight the epidemics, any local government officials found to be doing insufficiently in these efforts would need to bear the consequence, the responsibilities. So the local authority self-empowerment is true, but the anomalous pressure on them is also true. But of course, there is always the issue of privacy, individual rights being infringed upon. Now, as mentioned in the presentation, there is a balance that it needs to be maintained, and it's not to say that China has reached that balance, but that the collective value of fighting the epidemics together with protecting the privacy of individuals, these are two things very difficult to reconcile. Now, a final point about the broader international environment, that's the increasing China-US confrontation, which has been largely worsened by this epidemic. What would be the implication for China? Would China therefore become even more moving much further on in the direction of capitalism or neoliberal capitalism in its extreme form, or would it rather be the opposite of moving away from these directions? This we need to watch. At the moment, they are difficult to tell. But what is possible to judge is that from past experience, that from time to time, China wanted to say go further in marketization, liberalization, privatization, opening up to the world markets. But quite often, it's not that China didn't want to do it, but rather that the world capitalism itself cannot accommodate China from doing that. So again, the increasing efforts of the US to contain China by push China back away from that direction of further integration into the existing world capitalism. But we don't know. It might well be possible that China might want to show that we are more open than you, and therefore moving in that direction. So at the moment, I don't have any insights concerning this big broader issue. Okay, so back to Sam here.
Thank you guys for your input. I can see that Lucia has put up her hand. Yeah, we will come to you later, Lucia, just because we have 3 questions in line now. So I will read them out, and then let Dick Low or Haiku as well, you can respond to them. The first question is about the material basis, the comparison between China and the US in their material basis in preparing for the emergency in Dick's paper. Because it seems to show that United States has a much better material conditions than China in dealing with crises like this. However, as we can see on the ground, the mobilization is not only about just people-state mobilization, but also a large amount of input from the state-owned enterprises. For example, in the construction of the makeshift hospitals and a lot of other support as well. But that hasn't been mentioned in the paper. So just wonder if Dick has anything wanted to say about state-owned enterprises in their role in this crisis management as part of the systemic characteristics of China as well versus the US, which is largely privately run and private owned. The second question comes from Kandaka. He is putting the title as Apple versus Orange. It begins with his comments. I will put it out in the Q&A box, so I won't read it all out because it's quite lengthy. But it was mentioned there that the constitutional authority enjoyed by the 2 administrations, that is China and the US, is very different. conclusions derived from the research are susceptible to criticism. Consequently, Hirschman's analytical framework seems inappropriate to examine the nature of policy actions undertaken by the two administrations. And he also wants the clarification of tough model and loose model that's mentioned in the paper. Hasn't finished yet. In the case of COVID-19, the government of Canada's role has been praised both domestically and internationally. On the contrary, the US administration under Donald Trump is being harshly criticized, both domestically and internationally. The situation might have been better if someone else were in the Oval Office. Nevertheless, the United States cannot adopt COVID measures similar to those pursued by other developed democracies because the US health policy and the micro and macro structures of her economy would not permit it to do so. So that is semi-comment and question to you, Dick. The last one is from Adrian Butt. He mentioned it in the chat room, saying that PRC was able to impose drastic measure due to cooperation, in brackets. Isn't authoritarianism at least as good an explanation? Okay, so these are the three questions we have got for the first round. The next round we will come to Lucia. Okay.
Okay, so not the first a quick word about the state-owned enterprises. In fact, I use the term the state is not just the administration or not just the government, but in a broader sense that the state is the relationship between the political power and the general society, the general public or the society. So the state in the context of China includes the governments of not just the administration, but the government establishments, state-owned enterprises, and other kinds of less formal state-controlled or state-directed establishments. Now, all of these have been fully mobilized in the process of fighting the epidemic. So and it's not just fighting an epidemic, but also the economic and political consequences. Say, state-owned enterprises were asked to promote jobs, right? To provide jobs or to increase job openings, or at least to keep the existing jobs, right? And also to provide the necessary resources, say, to switch very quickly to the production of face masks or ventilators, so that China very quickly became the biggest supplier, not just for itself, but for the world. So all this concerning the role of the state-owned enterprises, first as an economic entity, but secondly, also have all kinds of so-called social responsibilities under the direct mandatory orders of the governments. Now, concerning apple versus orange, right? That as mentioned, that the one insight of the Hirschman theory is that the concerns the natures of the agents and the institutions. Right? So that when I talk about the comparison between China and the US, it's not just a comparison of the two persons, Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, or not just the Xi Jinping leadership versus the Trump presidency, or not just the Chinese government versus the US government. It is the political establishment of China versus the political establishment of the US. And the relationship between the establishment and the people in that is what we want to compare. Right? So it's true enough that the two administrations might have very different powers to exercise for coping with the epidemics. But what is important is that we are talking about the political economic establishments, or at least the political establishment of the two countries. Now, the concept of authoritarianism is very much a formalistic and descriptive. And as mentioned, it's not sufficient, in particular, from this time round of the actual experience of fighting the epidemics, right? That the concept of authoritarianism is very insufficient with respect to understanding the as mentioned, the accountability of the political establishment to the people and the representativeness of the establishment for the people. And this is also in relation to, as mentioned, the material conditions. Right? Now we need to rethink this way. Now, two countries, with China and the US, right? Which one has the political establishment that is more accountable to the people than the other, and more representative of the interests of the people to the others? That is the first level of thinking. The second level is that in consideration of the material condition, it's not just the living standards, not just income level, but the position of the state in the world, in the international interstate systems. It might be more appropriate to compare China with India rather than China with the US, because the Chinese state has multiple tasks unfinished, right? That therefore confronting a more hostile international system, say the nation building, the division or the creation and acquisition of the value produced, right, in the world. Right. To make it simple, right? China is the biggest industrial economy in the world, right? Its industrial output is equivalent to the more or less the US plus Japan plus Germany. But nevertheless, the Chinese renminbi's position in the international monetary system is quite modest, so that the Chinese economy is very highly dependent on the dollar hegemony, meaning that China has to pay a lot subsidizing the US economy. And therefore, it is a very traditional Leninist theory of imperialism, right? That the imperialist nations, they have the luxury of extracting surplus from the colonial, semi-colonial, or peripheral economies, so that it can be used to buy the loyalty of the labor aristocracy. Right? That is to say, it has the luxury to provide much better political and economic treatments to domestically. Right? Now, I'm not saying that this theory is universally true, but rather that this gives a pointer for consideration. Right? That China is in a much less favorable or much more hostile international environment compared with the US. Therefore, the relationship of the state to the people, that is in terms of accountability and representativeness, is with less room for maneuver, right, compared with the US. So, as mentioned, the first level to consider accountability and representativeness. The second level to take into consideration of the material condition. And of course, the third level is that whether or not China has been progressively improving or degenerating, right, in terms of the representativeness and accountability. We need to take all this into account not just in response to the concepts of authoritarianism, but rather those, as Heiko has mentioned, many Western left-wing activists or scholars have come up with a very negative view of China, that China is the worst type of capitalism vis-a-vis the US. And in our suggested readings, a paper by Aolong Yu is of this view. Is not necessarily I'm not necessarily criticizing the paper, but I recommended the reading of that paper because I consider it to be representative of the mainstream of Western left in viewing China. And in terms of its actual analysis of China's experience of fighting the epidemics, I think that there are quite a lot of factual deficiencies, or cherry picking this or that. But nevertheless, I have read a huge number of commentaries by Western left on China's coping with the epidemics, and I think that paper is very much representative of most Western left. Okay, so
thank you, Dick. Heiko, do you want to comment on any of these?
Not much, but the issue of authoritarianism, well, you know, there are many authoritarian states in the world. The distinction has always been in modern times between the character of the socio-economic system, as in, you know, is it a planned economy? Is it a capitalist economy? Is it dominated by the state bureaucracy in the name of the working class and the peasants, or is it dominated by capitalism in the name of democracy? And there is certainly some truth that those countries that have had, for example, Cuba, China, Vietnam, even North Korea, all the information on that seems to be a bit scant, but my assumption is the same, is that where they have these, like, for example, a friend of mine just came back from Cuba. He explained to me what was going on there. They had, when the emergency was declared there, they sent doctors and nurses to knock on people's doors twice a week. Then they sent medical students to go and check up on people 2 or 3 times a week, keeping regular records. The Committee for Defense of the Revolution in every street was also mobilized to facilitate the provision of resources and to allow people to engage in this lockdown. So, and I'm assuming, and I hope some other people from China can explain some details about that, but what we've seen is pretty much the same type of thing. And I don't think those mechanisms exist in that many other countries that you might call authoritarian, for example, in the Philippines, or, you know, and there was quite an authoritarian response by Modi in India, even though it's so-called democratic. So even there's quite a difference between the character of authoritarianism, even in what would be considered very authoritarian states, between overtly capitalist countries and those that are claiming to be socialist. There seems to be quite a distinction in the way they function, connected to the very nature of their political economy, the way the bureaucracy operates, the way the state plan operates, the way the party rules, and its claims to authority being rooted in public ownership and the protection of the interests of the masses. Having said that, I think it would be interesting to find out, which is a peculiar maybe anomaly on this, is that to know the extent to which the Chinese state made provision of resources for the working masses who were temporarily unable to work and receive income. You know, what sort of support was there for them? That I haven't seen. I don't know the details of. You know, I knew there was something about rent relief and this sort of thing, but otherwise, you know, in Britain there's been actually quite extensive support, but the policy's been a disaster. And so I think that would be interesting to touch on as well. If somebody knows details about that, it'd be nice to know.
Okay, thank you, Heiko. So we are now going to let as to the attendees.
Right. now, while we are waiting, I just want to say, give a quick comment on the notion of authoritarianism, right? That because it has been used so widely that, but my understanding is that authoritarianism implies that the government, right, or the ruling bloc in the political power is somehow above the society, superimposing its wills or its measures, right, on the society. Right? And therefore, this by definition is antithetical to the notion of cooperation, right, between the state and the society. So this is my response to the question given by Adrian Butt. And such a notion of the authoritarianism has indeed been widely used, not just by the media commentators, but as far as known, by scholars, by social science scholars. I think it's really the dominant view nowadays.
I mean, they're probably not going to come in and type up. This is different to talk than to type up, isn't it? So that's understandable.
Yeah, it is. Just want to double check that the function is still available to people who wanted to do so, because just having no response at all from the audience just make me think if it also works there.
Is it possible to make?
Okay, yes, we can. Okay, I can see a question then.
Okay.
Heiko and Dick, can you see the question? Right. Thank you very much for this presentation. That is from Matteo Capasso. Thank you. He is a research fellow at the European University Institute. What are the chances for a possible escalation of a military confrontation being pursued from the USA against China? I also would like to add that authoritarianism is a science fiction concept coined to describe global South countries from the West. It is very unhelpful and ahistorical to use. Why are Western Marxists so reluctant to learn from China model of development? Any thoughts?
Right. Now, the first question is obviously too difficult to answer, right? That the chance for possible escalation, like anything can happen, right, in the run-up to the US election, right? But nevertheless, we observe that what happened in South China Sea the last month, that two carrier fleets from the US exercising in the South China Sea with the Chinese Navy and China's is now known as the rocket. It used to be the missiles division, but now known as the rockets division. All this in alerts, but carefully looking at what's going on in the South China Sea. But in the end, the widely worried conflicts didn't occur, didn't materialize. There were the worries that the U.S. could bomb the structures built up by China in the different rocks in the South China Sea. So this indicates that after all, the U.S. establishment of the Donald Trump presidency is not that, how to put it, that it's still calculative rather than risk, being willing to risk for a confrontation. So in this sense, I'm a bit optimistic that military confrontation seems unlikely, even in this very tense environment and very unfavorable environment in the run-up to the US presidential election in 2 months' time. Now, the next bit is about why Western Marxists have been so unwilling to learn. One possibility, of course, is information. As a Hong Konger, I have observed, I have personal observation of what happened in Hong Kong, but I have read a huge number of commentaries by Western left-wing scholars or left-wing activists on what's going on in Hong Kong. And my judgment is that they have been fundamentally misled by the existing information flows, right? Or the manufacturing of information by the existing establishments. So this, of course, is a very superficial answer, possibly the immediate reason. The deeper reason, I think, is that the self-labeled left are not necessarily left. When leftists, when it comes to looking at the broader picture, that is the global, the world, the picture on the world scale. That's I call them the Western-centric left. They have always forgotten or ignored the fact of
I agree.
Systematic.
Oh, sorry.
Madele, sorry, Dick.
Yeah.
Just trying to see if this works. Madele, can you say something? We can hear you, I think.
Yeah, yes.
Can you hear me? Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
I had no idea my voice was there.
Okay, fine. Sorry, Dick, you can complete if there's anything that Madele wanted to come back and talk. Yeah.
So I welcome further responses.
Thank you.
Okay, Madele, do you have any follow-up questions to that?
No, I just want to thank you very much personally, since now I have the chance to do it both Dr. Dicklow and Dr. Eiko for the commentary to the paper. I mean, it's I think it's very timely and needed to have this kind of discussions, because as I'm seeing developing, and I'm also, you know, working in a very Eurocentric institution, and I'm seeing that the anti-sentiment towards China is ramping up. So it's really important to have this kind of discussions that try to, you know, to dismantle and also to present a picture that somehow is definitely much more balanced than what we hear on the everyday basis. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Madele. Thank you. It's nice to hear someone can actually speak on our platform. Thank you. We got another question that is from Samuel. Samuel, he also wanted to thank the organization for the excellent presentation. Thank you. My name is Samuel Spellman. I'm a PhD candidate for Pontifical Catholic University in Brazil. His question has to deal with a not that much comment aspect of China's response to the economic side of the COVID-19, or he would rather prefer to call it the economic crisis of 2020. So, as it has been commented on Chinese-related media overseas, President Xi Jinping is promoting a new theory of economic development, perhaps for the time being, called the dual circulation theory. It is basically a theory of focusing on the domestic market for the new next few years, perhaps as a dual response to both the 2020 crisis, but also to the US and several allies. Interestingly, not all of them, forced economic ostracism imposed on China. So do you have something to comment on that? Thank you for your question, Samuel.
I understand that we don't have much time, right? That the session is quickly approaching the end. So just a very quick answer to this, that China has always claimed that it wants to continue to promote globalization, that is to say, opening up and integrating into the world markets, of course, in terms that China considers to be beneficial to every participants, every nation state participating in the process of globalization, rather than a kind of unequal relationship. But now we need to note that quite apart from possible hostile approach adopted by the US, therefore containments, etc., it is also possible purely for technical reason that if the pandemic is to continue, then the world economy would suffer in terms of degrees of fragmentation. Would be likely that at least some parts of the world would be isolated, some other parts would be unable to have a communication with, not communication, to have the, say, normal trading, etc. relationship. So that in the events that there is the pandemic to persist in the months or even the years to come, and vaccine is not sufficient for coping with this, then globalization could not persist. Deglobalization could be possible. Therefore, internal circulation is necessary. It is not a deliberate policy of pursuing delinking or even autarky, but rather that such is the possibility. Okay, so we still have time?
Yeah, actually we are at 3:30 now. That is when we have to finish. But thank you very much for everyone for your input. I can also see Adrian has typed his response in the chat room as well. So I'll leave that open for a little bit if anyone wanted to read further on it. And then, yes, I'm sure they will take those comments on board. Thank you again for your support in our first attempt on an online webinar. We have a bit of a hiccup, but I think by and large it has run smoothly. It seems that it's a very popular subject about the future of Chinese development and the world as well. So we will looking forward to making more sessions on different subjects so that can promote the political economy of China, the studying of it, the research of it. So thank you again. And if you wanted to be notified of future events, make sure you follow us on the Eventbrite on the IIPPE China Working Group. Okay, thank you everyone. Bye.